My friends, have you ever wondered why the hardest battles come right before the greatest victories? Why the storm rages its fiercest before the dawn? Why the deepest pain often comes before the greatest breakthrough? Some of you listening today are in the middle of a struggle so deep, so painful that you don't see a way out. You've prayed, you've wept, you've done everything you know how to do, and yet the heavens seem silent. You're asking a God, where are you? Why is this happening to me? But I want to tell you something today. Before the breakthrough comes the pain, and there's a reason for it. Look at Joseph. He was given a dream from God, a destiny beyond imagination. But what happened next? He was betrayed by his brother, sold into slavery, falsely accused and thrown into prison. Year after year he suffered, but listen to me. His pain was not the end of the story, because in God's perfect timing, Joseph was lifted from the prison to the palace, from chains to a crown. Think about Job, a man who was upright, righteous before God, but one day everything was taken from him. His wealth, his health, his children. His friends told him to curse God and die, but Job refused. He said, although he slay me, yet will I trust in him. And what happened? In the end, God restored him, blessed him beyond what he had lost. Some of you today are on the verge of giving up. You've been praying for a breakthrough, for healing, for restoration, and all you've seen is more pain. But hear me, God has not forgotten you. He is not finished with your story. The enemy always fights the hardest when he knows something powerful is about to happen. That's why your struggle feels unbearable. That's why you're facing attack after attack. But listen, when you hold on, when you trust, when you refuse to let go of the promises of God, you will see his hand move in ways you never imagined. Remember the cross. There was no greater suffering, no greater agony than what Jesus endured on that day. The pain, the betrayal, the weight of the world's sin, he bore it all. And for 3 days, darkness covered the land. But then, on the third day, glory came. The stone was rolled away. The grave was empty. Victory was won. So I say to you today, hold on. Don't give up in the middle of the pain. Your breakthrough is coming. Your miracle is on the way. God is working even when you can't see it. And when the breakthrough comes, you will look back and say, it was worth it. God was faithful. Trust him. He will never fail you. The foundation of this message is built on one unshakable truth. Before the breakthrough comes the pain. This is not just an idea. It is a principle deeply woven into the very fabric of Scripture. From the first pages of Genesis to the final words of Revelation, the pattern repeats itself again and again. The pain, the suffering, the waiting, the struggle, these are not signs that God has abandoned his people, but rather that he is preparing them for something greater. When we open the Word of God, we find story after story that confirms this truth. Consider the life of Joseph. Here was a young man with a divine dream, a calling placed upon his life by God himself. He was given a vision of leadership, a future where he would be in a position of power and influence. But instead of stepping immediately into that promise, Joseph found himself betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit and sold into slavery. One moment, he was the favored son, and the next, he was shackled and carried away to a foreign land. And just when it seemed that things might turn around, when he gained favor in the house of Potiphar, he was falsely accused, thrown into prison, and left to languish in darkness. Now imagine what Joseph must have felt. He had done nothing wrong. He had remained faithful. Yet his life seemed to spiral further and further into hardship. But what Joseph did not know in those moments of suffering was that every single trial was part of God's perfect plan. The betrayal, the slavery, the prison, these were not detours from his destiny. They were the very path to it. Had Joseph not been sold into slavery, he would never have ended up in Egypt. Had he not been falsely accused, he would not have been placed in prison where he would meet the chief butler who would later bring his name before Pharaoh. And had Joseph not gone through all of that pain, he would not have been in the right place at the right time to become the second most powerful man in Egypt, saving countless lives during a time of famine, including the very brothers who had betrayed him. God had a plan. But before the breakthrough, Joseph had to endure the pain. Look at Moses, called by God to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. He was a man destined for greatness. But did he step into that calling overnight? No. Before he could lead, he had to spend 40 years in the wilderness tending sheep. He had to be stripped of his own self-sufficiency, broken of his own strength, and taught complete dependence on God. Only then, when he was ready, did God appear to him in the burning bush and commission him to go before Pharaoh. And what about the Israelites themselves? After being delivered from Egypt, they did not march straight into the promised land. Instead, they wandered for 40 years in the desert. Why? Because God was shaping them, molding them, testing them, and preparing them for what lay ahead. He knew they could not inherit the promise until they had first been refined in the wilderness. David, the man after God's own heart, was anointed king as a young shepherd boy. But did he ascend to the throne immediately? No. Instead, he spent years running for his life, hunted by King Saul, living in caves, enduring hardship and danger at every turn. Why? Because God was preparing him. Before he could wear the crown, he had to endure the pain of the wilderness. Before he could shepherd a nation, he had to learn to trust God in the darkest valleys. The pattern is unmistakable. Over and over again, we see this truth play out. The greater the calling, the greater the preparation, the deeper the suffering, the higher the purpose. And what we must understand is that God does not allow pain without purpose. He does not waste a single tear, a single trial, a single moment of suffering. What the enemy means for evil, God turns for good. The Apostle Paul understood this better than anyone. Here was a man who had once persecuted the church, but after his dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus, he became one of the greatest messengers of the gospel the world has ever known. And yet, his life was marked by suffering. He was beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked, stoned, and left for dead. He endured hunger, sleepless nights, and persecution beyond measure. And yet, he did not see these hardships as signs of God's absence. He saw them as evidence of God's power at work in his life. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 4:8-9, "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." He understood that the pain he endured was not meaningless. It was preparing him for an eternal glory that far outweighed anything he suffered. Even Jesus himself, the Son of God, was not exempt from this truth. Before the resurrection, there was the cross. Before the victory, there was the agony of Gethsemane. Before the crown, there was the suffering of Calvary, the greatest breakthrough in history. The defeat of sin and death came only after the deepest pain. Jesus in his humanity cried out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Yet even in that moment of suffering, God was accomplishing the greatest work of all. And if this was true for Jesus, how much more will it be true for us? Pain is not a sign that God has left you. It is not evidence that he has forgotten his promises. In fact, it is often the opposite. It is proof that he is at work. It is the refining fire that prepares you for the calling he has placed on your life. So when the pain comes, do not lose heart. When the storm rages, when the night seems endless, when the burden feels too heavy to bear, hold on, because the breakthrough is coming. And when it does, you will look back and see that every tear, every trial, and every painful moment was leading you to something far greater than you ever imagined. There is something deeply human about pain. It reaches into the core of who we are, testing our resolve, stretching our faith, and at times making us question everything we believe. When we are in the midst of suffering, it can feel overwhelming, isolating, and unbearable. But one of the greatest truths found in Scripture is that pain is never without purpose. It is never wasted. If we look at the lives of the great men and women of faith, we see that every single one of them walked through suffering before they saw God's promises fulfilled. And in those moments of pain, they faced choices, whether to trust God or to turn away, whether to hold on or to give up. And that is where the emotional weight of this truth lies. Because suffering does not just affect our circumstances. It reaches deep into our hearts, shaping who we are and how we see God. Consider the story of Hannah. She was a woman who longed for a child, but for years her womb remained barren. In a culture where children were seen as a sign of God's favor, her suffering was not just personal, it was public. She carried shame, rejection, and sorrow that ran so deep that even in the temple of God, when she poured out her heart in prayer, the priest thought she was drunk. That is how much pain she carried. And yet in that moment of desperation, she did the one thing that changed everything. She surrendered. She let her pain drive her to the feet of God rather than away from him. And in his perfect timing, God answered her cry, giving her a son. Samuel, who would go on to anoint the first kings of Israel. There is something about suffering that brings us to our knees in a way nothing else can. When life is easy, when everything is going as planned, we can convince ourselves that we're in control. But pain strips away that illusion. It forces us to confront our own weakness, our own limitations, and ultimately our need for God. Think about Job, a man who had everything, wealth, health, family, only to lose it all in a series of unimaginable tragedies. One moment, he was the richest man in the land, and the next, he was sitting in ashes, scraping his sores with broken pottery, his body in agony, his heart shattered. And to make matters worse, his friends accused him, assuming his suffering must be the result of sin. Even his wife told him to curse God and die. And here is where we see the true weight of suffering. It is not just the loss itself, but the loneliness that comes with it. The sense that no one understands, that no one sees, that even God himself has turned away. But Job did something remarkable. Though he questioned, though he wept, though he wrestled with the deepest pain imaginable, he never let go of God. He held on. And in the end, God restored him, not just with blessings, but with a deeper revelation of who he is. Job said, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." Suffering as a way of stripping away the distractions, the noise, the things we once thought were important, and leaving us with one thing, God. And in that place, in that sacred space of brokenness, something happens. We begin to know him not just as a concept, not just as a distant figure, but as the one who walks with us through the fire. Look at the disciples. When they followed Jesus, they believed they were stepping into a life of power and victory. They saw miracles. They heard the words of life. They witnessed the authority he carried. But then came the cross, and with it, fear, doubt, and despair. They had left everything for him, and now he was gone. Their hope died with him. Imagine the weight of those 3 days. Imagine the questions that must have haunted them. Had they been wrong? Had they wasted everything? Was God's plan really what they thought it was? But then, on the 3rd day, the tomb was empty. Jesus had risen, and suddenly all the pain, all the fear, all the despair made sense, because it was in the suffering of the cross that victory was secured. It was in the darkest moment that the greatest miracle was unfolding. And that is what we must understand about our own suffering. It is not pointless. It is not the end. It is often the very thing God is using to prepare us for something greater. There are moments in life where we will not understand what God is doing. There are seasons where it will feel like he is silent, like he has forgotten us, like he is distant. But those are the moments when we must remember his promises. He said he would never leave us nor forsake us. He said that he works all things together for the good of those who love him. He said that though weeping may endure for a night, joy comes in the morning. Paul knew suffering better than most. He was beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked, and persecuted for the sake of the gospel. But he also knew something deeper. He knew that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. He understood that our pain is not wasted, but that it is shaping us, refining us, and preparing us for something eternal. There is a refining that happens in suffering that cannot happen any other way. Gold is purified in fire. Diamonds are formed under pressure. Oil is pressed out of olives, and faith is strengthened in the furnace of affliction. If you are walking through suffering right now, I want to tell you that God sees you. He knows your pain. He has not abandoned you. Even when you cannot feel him, even when the answers do not come, even when the darkness feels overwhelming, he is there, and he is working. There will come a day when you look back and see that what you thought would break you was actually the thing that built you. That the pain you thought was unbearable was actually leading you to a greater joy. That the suffering you thought was meaningless was actually preparing you for a breakthrough beyond anything you could have imagined. Hold on. Do not give up. Because the pain you are feeling today is not the end of your story. It is simply the beginning of something greater than you ever dreamed. Throughout history, God has used the trials and suffering of his people to prepare them for something greater. When we examine the lives of the great men and women of faith, we see a consistent pattern. Before they stepped into their purpose, they endured hardship, pain, and testing. These stories are not just historical accounts, they are lessons for us today. They remind us that suffering is not the end of the road, but rather the refining fire that shapes us for the destiny God has prepared. Look at Joseph. He was given a dream as a young man, a promise from God that he would one day rise to a position of great influence. But before he saw the fulfillment of that promise, he endured betrayal, slavery, false accusations, and imprisonment. It would have been easy for him to believe that his dream had died, that God had forgotten him. But every trial Joseph faced was not a setback. It was a setup. Every hardship was part of God's perfect plan to place him in the exact position he needed to be at the right time. When Pharaoh had a dream that no one could interpret, Joseph was called from prison and elevated to the second highest position in Egypt. What seemed like years of suffering were actually years of preparation. Think about Moses. He was born into slavery, but was miraculously saved as an infant and raised in Pharaoh's palace. He had everything, a privileged life, education, and access to power. But before God could use him to lead his people, Moses had to be stripped of everything. After killing an Egyptian, he fled into the wilderness, spending 40 years as a shepherd. From the outside, it may have looked like his life had been wasted. But in reality, God was shaping him, teaching him humility, patience, and dependence. When the time was right, God called Moses from the burning bush and sent him to deliver the Israelites. Every moment of pain had a purpose. Then there was David. Anointed as a young boy to be the future king of Israel, he did not immediately ascend to the throne. Instead, he spent years running for his life from King Saul, hiding in caves, and facing constant danger. He had been chosen by God, yet he was hunted like a criminal. Why? Because God was preparing him. The time in the wilderness, the betrayals, the hardships, they all shaped David into the king he was meant to be. By the time he took the throne, he was not just a man with a title, but a man who had learned to trust God in every circumstance. Look at Esther. She was just an ordinary Jewish girl until she was taken into the palace of the Persian king. She could have remained silent and comfortable in her position, but when her people faced destruction, she had a choice. She could risk everything or do nothing. She stepped forward in courage, saying, "If I perish, I perish." Her pain, her fear, and her uncertainty were all part of the preparation for the moment when she would save an entire nation. And what about Job? A righteous man who lost everything, his wealth, his health, his children, yet he refused to curse God. His suffering was unimaginable, and yet in the end, God restored him and gave him even more than he had before. Job's story teaches us that even when we do not understand why we are suffering, God is still at work. The Bible is filled with these examples, but none is greater than Jesus himself. He came to earth knowing that his mission was to suffer and die for the sins of the world. He was rejected, mocked, beaten, and crucified. His disciples, who had walked with him and believed in his kingdom, watched in despair as he was nailed to a cross. For 3 days, it seemed as if all hope was lost. But then on the third day, he rose again. The pain of the cross was necessary for the victory of the resurrection. The pattern is clear. Before the breakthrough comes the pain. Before the promise is fulfilled, there is a season of testing. Before the victory, there is a battle. Before the crown, there is a cross. Every great person God has used has gone through a time of suffering, waiting, or refining. These stories are not just meant to inspire us. They are meant to remind us that when we face pain and hardship, we are in good company. When it feels like we have been forgotten, when it seems like our dreams have been delayed, when the pain is too much to bear, we must remember that God is working behind the scenes. The same God who was with Joseph in the prison, with Moses in the wilderness, with David in the caves, and with Jesus in the tomb is with us in our struggles. It is in the waiting that we are strengthened. It is in the suffering that we learn to depend on God. It is in the fire that we are refined. When we look at the great men and women of faith, we see that their pain was never wasted. Neither is ours. God is using it to prepare us for something greater than we can imagine. Faith is easy when life is good. It's easy to believe in God's promises when everything is falling into place, when prayers are answered, when doors open, when we feel His presence. But what happens when the storm comes? What happens when the waiting feels endless? When the pain becomes unbearable? When the silence of heaven stretches on for what seems like forever? That is where true faith is tested. Not in the light, but in the darkness. Not in the victory, but in the struggle. Not in the breakthrough, but in the moments before it. Pain has a way of shaking us to the core. It makes us question everything we thought we knew. It whispers lies. God has forgotten you. You are alone. Things will never change. But in those moments, we have a choice. Will we let the pain push us away from God, or will we allow it to draw us closer to Him? Think of Abraham. He was given a promise, a son, a great nation, descendants as numerous as the stars. But what happened next? Nothing. Year after year, he and Sarah waited. The promise did not come quickly. They grew old. Their faith was stretched. And yet in Romans 4:20 it says, he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God. Even when everything in the natural said it was impossible, Abraham held on. And in the end, the promise was fulfilled. Look at Noah. God told him to build an ark to prepare for a flood when there was no rain. Can you imagine the ridicule he endured? The years of waiting, building, obeying with no sign of what God had promised, but he remained faithful. He kept building. And one day the rain came. Faith is not about seeing, it's about trusting. It's believing in God's goodness even when circumstances suggest otherwise. It's standing firm when the storm rages. It's refusing to give up even when every part of us wants to. Job understood this. He lost everything, his children, his wealth, his health. And yet he declared, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. That kind of faith is not shallow. It is not based on feelings or circumstances. It is rooted in the unshakable character of God. Paul faced relentless suffering, beatings, shipwrecks, imprisonment, rejection. He could have walked away. He could have said, this is too much. But instead he wrote, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. He knew that the suffering of this present time was nothing compared to the glory that was coming. The enemy wants to use pain to break us, to destroy our faith, but God uses it to strengthen us. He uses it to strip away everything we rely on, so that all that remains is Him. He allows us to walk through valleys so that we learn to lean on Him completely. Jesus Himself gave us the greatest example of faith in the face of suffering. In the Garden of Gethsemane, He prayed in agony, sweating drops of blood, knowing what lay ahead. And yet He said, and not my will, but yours be done. He trusted the Father even to the point of death. And because of His obedience, the greatest victory in history was won. Faith is not about avoiding pain. It's about enduring it with the confidence that God is still in control. It's about looking at the mountain and saying, I don't know how, I don't know when, but I know my God is faithful. It's about holding on when everything in us wants to let go. If you are in a season of suffering, do not let go of your faith. Do not believe the lie that God has abandoned you. He is working behind the scenes. The breakthrough will come. The promise will be fulfilled. The story is not over. Hold on, keep trusting, because the pain you feel now is only the beginning of something greater than you can imagine. Pain has a way of distorting our vision. When we are in the middle of suffering, it can feel like it will never end. It can feel like God is silent, like the weight is too much to bear, like the night will never turn to morning. But the truth is this: God always has a plan, and His plan is always greater than what we can see in the moment. When we go through suffering, we tend to focus on the present pain rather than the future purpose. We see the hardship, the trial, the loss, but God sees beyond it. He sees what is being formed in us, the strength that is being developed, the faith that is being refined. We often pray for deliverance from the struggle, but God is using the struggle to shape us for something greater. Look at Joseph. When he was betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, and sold into slavery, did he see the throne that was waiting for him in Egypt? When he was falsely accused and sent to prison, did he know that those very chains were leading him to the fulfillment of God's promise? In the middle of his suffering, all he could see was injustice and pain. But God was orchestrating something far bigger than Joseph could comprehend. Years later, when he stood before his brothers as a ruler over Egypt, he declared, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." The suffering was real, but so was the purpose behind it. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before he ever stood before Pharaoh. If you had asked him during those years of waiting whether he felt like a deliverer, he likely would have laughed. He was a man who once lived in a palace but was now tending sheep in obscurity. It would have been easy for him to believe that his best days were behind him. But God had a plan. The wilderness was not punishment, it was preparation. God was shaping him into the leader who would one day stand before Pharaoh and declare, "Let my people go." David was anointed to be king as a young shepherd boy, but his journey to the throne was anything but immediate. Instead of stepping into his calling right away, he spent years running for his life, hiding in caves and facing betrayal. If you had asked him in those moments if he still believed in God's promise, it would have taken great faith to say yes. But through the trials, David was being shaped. The hardships were making him into a king who would not rely on his own strength, but on the power of God. One of the greatest lies the enemy tells us in the midst of our suffering is that there is no purpose in it. He wants us to believe that God has abandoned us, that the pain is meaningless, that we will never see the fulfillment of what we hope for. But the enemy is a liar. Every great testimony in the Bible, every great breakthrough in history has come through a season of suffering first. Before the resurrection, there was the cross. Before the promised land, there was the wilderness. Before the miracle, there was the waiting. Jesus himself knew suffering beyond anything we could ever imagine. He was mocked, beaten, rejected by his own people, and nailed to a cross. The disciples who followed him must have felt like all hope was lost. For 3 days, the world sat in darkness. But what they could not see in that moment was that the greatest victory in history was unfolding. What looked like defeat was actually the greatest triumph of all time. This is how God works. He takes what seems broken and brings healing. He takes what looks like failure and turns it into victory. He takes the suffering that feels unbearable and uses it to bring about something greater than we could have ever imagined. Paul understood this. He was beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked, and yet he wrote, "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us." He knew that the pain of this life was temporary, but the work God was doing through it was eternal. When we are in the middle of suffering, we must remind ourselves that God is not finished. He is still writing the story. The night may be long, but morning is coming. The storm may rage, but the sun will shine again. The pain may feel overwhelming, but the breakthrough's on the horizon. God does not waste our suffering. He uses it. He shapes us through it. He strengthens us in it. And when we come out on the other side, we will see that everything we walked through was not for nothing. It was for His glory. It was for our good. It was for a purpose greater than we could have ever imagined.